He almost didn't stop. That's the part that Ray Hargrove would think about for years afterward. The fact that he almost just pulled out of that parking lot, swung his bike onto Route 9, and kept riding like he hadn't seen a thing. He was tired. His back ached from 5 hours in the saddle. The charity ride had gone long. The sun was already leaning west over the Indiana flatlands, and all he wanted was a cold drink and an empty highway. But something made him look again. She was sitting on the curb at the edge of the gas station lot, maybe 20 feet from the air pump, maybe 30 from the road, a little girl alone, her knees pulled up to her chest. She couldn't have been older than 5. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt with a dog on it, dirty at the hem, and she had face paint on, one of those swirled butterfly designs, the kind kids get at carnivals. Except the paint was smeared, streaked down one side of her face like she'd been crying for a long time, or like someone had grabbed her. And she was still crying. Not loudly. That was what stopped Ray's breath. Not the kind of crying where a kid throws herself on the floor over a dropped ice cream cone. This was the quiet kind. The kind where the child has already learned that crying loud doesn't help. Ray killed his engine. He sat there for a moment, one boot on the asphalt, and looked around the lot. There were 4 other bikes from the Iron Road chapter parked by the pumps. His friend Pete Dolan was inside paying. A woman in a minivan was filling up on the far side. Nobody else seemed to notice the little girl. He swung his leg off the bike and walked over. He crouched down about 6 feet away from her, far enough so she wouldn't feel cornered, and he waited. She looked up at him with these enormous brown eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, a streak of blue and green face, paint cutting across her left cheek like a bruise trying to hide behind art. And that's when Ray noticed it. Under the paint on her left eye, the skin was darker. Not paint dark, not shadow dark, the wrong kind of dark. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low. "You okay, sweetheart?" She didn't answer. She just looked at him the way small animals look at strangers. Not with hostility, but with the exhausted calculation of a creature that has learned to assess danger quickly. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. A sniff. "Lacey." "Lacey. My name's Ray." He didn't reach toward her. He kept his hands resting on his knees, open, visible, the way you'd behave around a dog that had been hit. "Are you here with somebody?" She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Are you waiting for somebody?" A pause so long that Ray felt his chest tighten. Then, very quietly, she said, "My mom left me here." Ray took a slow breath. He looked at the painted eye. He looked at the smeared streaks on her cheek. He looked at the way she was holding her left arm slightly tucked against her side, protective, like it hurt. He kept his voice even. "Lacey, who did this to you?" She dropped her gaze to the pavement. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of a big rig rolling past on the highway and the mechanical click of Pete's pump across the lot. Then she looked back up at Ray, and it wasn't fear on her face anymore. It was something sadder than fear. Something that looked like resignation. "It's my mom, sir," she whispered. Ray Hargrove was 44 years old. He had buried a wife. He had buried a daughter. He had seen things in his life that had scoured him right down to the bone and left him functional but fundamentally altered, the way a piece of wood looks after you sand it too hard. Still solid, still useful, but lighter than it used to be. And in all of that, nothing had hit him the way those 5 words did. "It's my mom, sir." The way she said "sir," like she was apologizing, like she already knew how this would go, that adults would hear, would nod, would do some paperwork, and that she would go back. Ray did not do paperwork, but he also didn't do anything reckless. Not yet. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911. Pete Dolan came out of the gas station with 2 bottles of water and stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Ray crouched on the curb next to a little girl, phone pressed to his ear. Pete was 51, built like a retired linebacker, with forearms you could balance a dinner plate on. He had a long white scar along his jaw from a bar fight in 1998 that he'd never fully explained to anyone. But Pete Dolan also coached Little League on Saturdays. He had 4 grandchildren, and when he read the situation in about 3 seconds flat, he walked over quietly, sat down on the curb a respectful distance from the girl, and twisted open one of the water bottles. "You thirsty?" he said to Lacey. She looked at the bottle. She looked at Pete's enormous, scarred hand holding it out to her. She took it. The other 2 riders from the Iron Road chapter, a retired plumber named Hatch, and a Vietnam vet everyone called Grub, drifted over without being asked. None of them made a big show of it. They just arranged themselves, quietly, like a wall. The dispatcher on Ray's phone was asking him questions. He answered them one by one, keeping his eyes on Lacey, watching the way she drank fast, like she hadn't had water in a while. The deputy arrived in 11 minutes. His name was Walt Briggs, a lean, careful man in his early 40s with a short mustache and the kind of unhurried competence that takes 20 years to develop. He assessed the scene at the curb. 4 bikers, 1 small girl, 1 man crouched beside her, and he didn't flinch, which Ray appreciated. Walt crouched down beside Lacey and asked her the same questions Ray had asked in a gentler, more official voice. She gave him the same answers. Then Walt looked at the face paint, and his expression shifted, subtle, but Ray caught it. "Can I look at your eyes, sweetheart?" Walt asked. Lacey hesitated. Then she turned her face slightly. Walt Briggs had been a deputy in Hendricks County for 19 years. He didn't say anything. He just reached for his radio. Now, here's what you need to understand about Ray Hargrove before this story goes any further. Because if you're going to understand what he did next, the thing that would later be debated in living rooms and church basements and comment sections across the county, you need to understand what kind of man he was before that parking lot. Ray grew up in Mooresville, Indiana. Father was a machinist. Mother taught 2nd grade for 31 years. He was the kind of kid who was good at everything practical and mediocre at everything academic, which in a working-class Indiana town in the 1990s made him practically royalty. He fixed engines before he fixed grades. He built a deck for his parents' house when he was 16. He never quite figured out what he wanted to do, so he did everything: construction, contracting, a brief and enthusiastic flirtation with home renovation that eventually became a legitimate business. He married Susan Hargrove, born Susan Paulette Keller, when he was 27. She was a dental hygienist with a loud laugh and a tendency to cry at commercials, and she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he knew it from the first month. They had 1 daughter, Annie. Annie Hargrove was born on a Thursday in October, 8 years before this story begins. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's loud laugh and a personality so vivid that people who met her for 5 minutes remembered her for years. Ray used to say she ran on a different frequency than other kids, like her signal was coming in clearer, stronger, more alive. Annie was 3 years old when the accident happened. A pickup truck ran a red light on State Road 67 on a wet November morning. Susan was driving. Annie was in the back seat. Ray spent 6 days in the hospital. When he came out, he was the only one who did. What do you do with that? What do you do when the 2 people who made your life feel like a life are just gone? When you wake up in a hospital bed and realize that the house you're going home to has 3 bedrooms and a toy box and a half-finished Christmas list stuck to the refrigerator. You do what Ray did. You work. You ride. You find men who've also had pieces of themselves removed by the world. Veterans, widowers, guys who carry grief the way other people carry wallets, always present, never mentioned, and you ride with them on Saturdays. You do charity runs for children's hospitals. You don't talk about Annie. You don't take down her pictures. You just keep going because what else is there? For 6 years, that was Ray Hargrove. And now, in the parking lot of the gas station on Route 9, there was a 5-year-old girl with a bruised eye, sitting on a curb with a half-empty water bottle, And she had said, "It's my mom," sir, in the saddest, most matter-of-fact voice Ray had ever heard in his life. And the part of him that had been carrying Annie's empty weight for 6 years felt something shift. Keep watching, because what Ray discovers over the next 48 hours is going to change everything you think you know about this story. The mother arrived 22 minutes after the deputy. Her name, as Ray would later learn, was Diane Mercer, 31 years old, dark-haired, wearing a gas station uniform with the name tag still on. She pulled into the lot in a dented white Civic, got out fast, and her first words were not, "Is she okay?" or "Thank God you found her." Her first words were, "What did she say?" Walt Briggs stepped in front of her before she could reach Lacey. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm." "I'm calm," Diane said, and she was technically. Her voice was flat, her face was controlled, her eyes were doing a very fast and practiced scan of the situation. "I just need to know what she told you." "Ma'am, your daughter has visible bruising around her left eye." "Can you tell me how that happened?" Diane's jaw tightened. "She fell. She fell off the porch step day before yesterday. I've been meaning to take her in. I've just been working doubles." "She fell?" Ray said. He wasn't yelling. His voice was completely level. But every man in that parking lot, Pete Hatch Grubb, Walt Briggs, turned to look at him because there was something in Ray's tone that was very, very quiet in the way that a pressure cooker gets quiet right before. "Sir, I need you to step back," Walt said. Ray stepped back. He folded his arms. He watched. What followed was a long, procedural conversation that Ray was not privy to. Walt walking Diane to the far side of his cruiser, a second deputy arriving, a woman from Child Services who appeared like she'd been waiting in the wings. Lacey sat on the curb the whole time, picking at a loose thread on her sneaker, and Pete Dolan sat beside her, and at one point she leaned against his enormous arm like it was a wall she decided to trust. Ray watched all of it. He watched the way Diane kept glancing over at Lacey, not with maternal worry, but with the quick, surveillance quality of someone checking whether a liability was contained. He watched the way Lacey never once looked at her mother. He watched the Child Services woman kneel in front of Lacey and ask questions, and he watched Lacey answer in single words, eyes on the ground. And he watched, 45 minutes later, when Diane Mercer was allowed to take Lacey to her car. Not to a hospital, to the car. Ray took 3 steps forward. "You're letting her go?" Walt Briggs stepped in his path. Not aggressively, just firmly. "Sir, there's a process. The kid has a bruised eye." "There's a process," Walt said again, and this time his voice had an edge under the patience. "There'll be a welfare check. There are protocols. I need you to trust the system." Ray looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the white Civic, where Lacey had just been buckled in. Diane hadn't touched her, he noticed. Hadn't hugged her, hadn't kissed her head, hadn't done any of the things you do when you found your child alone and frightened. She just buckled the seatbelt and gotten in. "I trust the system," Ray said finally. He pulled out his phone. "Can I give you my number? In case you need a witness statement." "Already have it," Walt said, and something in his expression, something around the eyes, told Ray that he wasn't as okay with this outcome as his words suggested. Ray watched the Civic pull out of the lot. Then he got on his bike. He didn't go home. He rode slowly past the address. He'd gotten it from the intake form, not by sneaking a look, but because Pete Dolan had somehow charmed the Child Services woman into confirming the neighborhood, the way Pete could charm most people into most things when he put his mind to it. It was a rental house on Sycamore Trace, a dead-end street 6 miles from the gas station. White siding, brown shutters, a yard that had given up the idea of grass somewhere around the second summer. There was a black Ford pickup in the driveway. Ray slowed as he passed. The Civic wasn't there yet. The lights were on inside, through the front window, and he only looked for a second. He wasn't going to be that guy. He could see the shape of someone moving. A man, big, heavy-shouldered. Ray, kept writing. But he noted the truck. He noted the plates. He noted the house. He went home, showered, ate a sandwich he barely tasted, and then sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and started doing what he was actually quite good at, figuring things out. Ray had spent 20 years in construction and contracting. You don't survive that industry without learning how to find information, building permits, property records, ownership histories, contractor licenses. You develop an eye for paper trails. By 11 o'clock that night, he knew who owned the black Ford pickup. Kurt Spence, 38 years old. 2 prior addresses in Indiana, 1 in Ohio. No current employment on record. In a 2019 domestic disturbance call, charges filed, charges later dropped at the Ohio address. Ray stared at that last line for a long time. Charges filed, charges dropped. He knew what that usually meant. He'd seen it before, not personally, but in the world. In the lives of women who were afraid of what happened after the charges didn't stick. In the silence that followed, he went to bed. He didn't sleep. Here's where this story takes its first turn. And you're going to want to pay close attention, because what Ray finds out over the next 24 hours isn't what he expected at all. The next morning, Ray drove, not rode, drove, in his truck, less conspicuous, back to the neighborhood near Sycamore Trace. He wasn't going to the house. He was going to the house 2 doors down, where a woman named Ruth Alderman had a hand-lettered sign in her yard that read Fresh EGS, $3 per DOZ, and a front porch that suggested she spent considerable time on it. Ray was right. Ruth was on the porch by 7:15 with a cup of coffee and the expression of a woman who regarded the neighborhood as her personal broadcast network. He introduced himself. He said he was a contractor doing an estimate on a property nearby, and he was doing a little neighborhood research, which was almost true in a parallel universe. He asked how long she'd lived on the street. 22 years, Ruth told him. He asked, casually, about the house with the white siding. Ruth's mouth went thin. She talked for 37 minutes. What Ray learned: Diane Mercer had moved in 14 months ago, initially alone with her daughter. She'd seemed all right at first, quiet, kept to herself, went to work early. Then about 8 months ago, a man had moved in. Big man, black truck, named Kurt. Ruth had heard his name through the walls of social interaction, the way you hear music from a passing car. Incomplete, but recognizable. After Kurt moved in, Ruth said things changed. Lacey stopped playing in the yard. There were arguments, not always loud, but always tense. The kind of arguments Ruth described as having a temperature. You didn't hear words, you just felt the heat of them through the walls. Once in March, Ruth had seen Lacey outside alone at 6 in the morning, sitting on the porch steps in a nightgown, like she'd been put out. Ruth had gone to ask if she was okay. Lacey had said she was fine. She'd been using a phrase Ruth had found strange for a child that age. I'm not supposed to bother anyone. Ray drove home with his hands very tight on the steering wheel. That afternoon, he called Deputy Walt Briggs. Walt sounded tired. He said the welfare check had been conducted that morning. Diane had been home. Lacey had been there. Lacey had repeated the story about falling off the porch. The bruise was consistent, technically, with the fall. The house was clean. There was food. You're closing it, Ray said. I'm not closing anything, Walt said, and he sounded like he was choosing each word carefully. But I can't remove a child from a home because a neighbor and a biker have a bad feeling. What would it take? A long pause. More than I have right now. Ray hung up. He sat in his truck in the driveway of his own house for a while, thinking about a little girl who had learned not to cry loudly because it didn't help. Thinking about the phrase, I'm not supposed to bother anyone. Thinking about his daughter Annie, who had never once in her 3 years of life been taught to shrink. Then he called Pete Dolan. I need a favor, he said. Of course you do, Pete said. What kind of favor? The kind that stays off the books, but isn't illegal. A pause. Define isn't illegal. I need eyes on a house. Rotating. Discreet. Just watching. Another pause. Longer this time. Then Pete said, "How many people do you need?" The Iron Road chapter had 14 active members. Within 6 hours of Ray's call, Pete had quietly organized a rotation. 2 men at a time, parked at different points near Sycamore Trace in personal vehicles. Nothing obvious, nothing confrontational. Hatch had a cousin who lived 2 streets over and was willing to let a few guys use his driveway. Grubb, who had spent 3 years as an Army scout in Vietnam and had a talent for stillness that bordered on supernatural, took the first overnight shift himself. Ray drove past twice, each time at different hours, each time without stopping. On the second day, Grubb called him at 6 in the evening. "The man came out," Grubb said. His voice was its usual unhurried drawl. Walked to the truck. Had the girl with him. Ray's chest contracted. And he opened the truck door. She didn't want to get in. She kind of leaned back. He put his hand on the back of her neck. And a pause. Steered her in. Not a hit, but not gentle. Did she say anything? Couldn't hear. But she had that face. Grubb paused again. You know the face. The one where a kid's trying to be invisible. Ray knew the face. He'd seen it on the curb of a gas station. "Stay there," Ray said. He called Walt Briggs. Walt listened to everything Ray told him. Grubb's account, Ruth's account, Kurt Spence's record in Ohio. "Ray," Walt said, "I hear you. I do. But an ex-girlfriend's dropped charges from 2019 and a neighbor's description of a man walking a kid to a truck. It's a pattern, Walt. It's a suggestion of a pattern. A lawyer would eat me alive." "Then let me give you something better," Ray said. Another long pause. "Ray, don't do anything I'm going to have to arrest you for. I'm not going to the house." "That's not what I asked." Ray took a breath. "I'm not going to do anything illegal, Walt. I'm going to go talk to someone." "Who?" "The only person who knows everything," Ray said. And he meant Diane. Now stop for a second, because you might be thinking, why would Diane talk to him? She'd already lied to a deputy. She'd kept her story straight, kept her face controlled, kept the whole machine running. Why would she talk to a stranger? Here's why. Because Ray Hargrove wasn't going to her house. He wasn't going to confront Kurt. He was going to her workplace, the gas station where she wore the name tag. At 7 in the morning, 2 days later, when he knew from Grubb's rotation that Kurt's truck left the house at 6:45. And he wasn't going to threaten her. He wasn't going to demand anything. He was going to buy a coffee and tell her his daughter's name. Diane Mercer was behind the counter when Ray walked in. She recognized him immediately. Her whole body went still in that specific way that people go still when they see someone they hoped they'd never see again. Ray walked to the counter. He ordered coffee. He waited while she made it. He paid. He put his change in the tip jar. And then he said quietly, her name was Annie. "My daughter." She was 3. Diane stared at him. "I'm not here to threaten you," Ray said. "I'm not recording this. I'm not going to say a word to anyone about what you tell me." He paused. "I just need you to hear something." Diane didn't move, but she didn't call for her manager either. "The thing about a kid who goes quiet," Ray said, "is that by the time they go quiet, they've already been taught that noise doesn't work. You know what I mean by that?" Something happened in Diane's face. Something very small and very significant. A tremor, a crack in the controlled surface like a fissure in ice. "Lacey told me on that curb," Ray continued. "She didn't cry loud. She just sat there, alone, and when I asked who did that to her, she wasn't angry. She wasn't dramatic. She just told me. Like she'd accepted it." Diane's jaw was tight. Her eyes were very bright. "5-year-olds don't accept things," Ray said. "They scream and throw fits and believe in monsters under the bed. They don't accept things. When a 5-year-old accepts something, it means they've been shown over and over that there is no point in resisting it." A tear ran down Diane's left cheek. She didn't wipe it. "I know what he is," Ray said. I know about the Ohio charges. And I think you know what he is too. I think you've known for a while and you've been calculating, because that's what you do when you're scared. You calculate. You think about what happens if you say something versus what happens if you don't. He picked up his coffee. I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm not asking you to do anything today. I'm just asking you to think about the face your daughter had on that curb. He walked to the door. Stopped. She said, "It's my mom, sir," he said without turning around. "Not it's my mom's boyfriend. Not it's the man who lives with us." She said her mom. And I think she said it because she doesn't understand yet the difference between someone who does the hurting and someone who lets it happen. He pushed the door open. "She will though," he said. "When she's older, she'll understand the difference. And she'll remember which one you were." He walked out. He drove home. And he waited. He didn't have to wait long. 36 hours later, at 4:17 in the afternoon, Ray's phone rang. Unknown number. He picked up. It was Diane. Her voice was fast, low, and fractured. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was sprinting through it before she could change her mind. She talked for 11 minutes. Ray listened to every word without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Are you and Lacey somewhere safe right now?" "He's at. He won't be back until late." "But, listen to me," Ray said. "I want you to call Deputy Walt Briggs. Right now. His direct number." He read it out. "Tell him everything you just told me. I'll be in that parking lot when you call. He'll have a second witness the moment the call connects." A long silence. Then, what if he finds out before? "He won't," Ray said, "because you're going to make that call, and Walt is going to move fast, and by the time that man gets home tonight, you and Lacey are not going to be there." Another silence. The longest of the whole conversation. "What you told me," Ray said quietly, "about Tommy." Diane made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Does anyone else know?" Ray asked. "No," she whispered. "Okay," Ray said. "Then we have to move right now." This is the part of the story that Ray would never fully explain to people afterward. Not because it was unclear, but because the truth of it was almost too simple, and simple truths have a way of sounding like lies. What Diane had told him, the thing that had shifted the entire story, was this. There was a room at the back of the house on Sycamore Trace, past the kitchen, where the door was always locked, was a room that had been converted into what was essentially a second bedroom. Diane had told Ray about it the way you tell someone about something you've been staring at from a distance for so long that you'd stopped seeing it clearly. Like she was describing it for the first time, even to herself. Inside that room was a boy. His name was Tommy. He was 7 years old. He was Lacey's brother, not Diane's child, but Kurt's, from a previous relationship. A woman somewhere in Ohio who had, according to Kurt, abandoned the boy, though the word abandoned was doing a great deal of work in that explanation, and Diane had, in recent months, begun to wonder exactly how much. Kurt kept Tommy separate, kept him quiet, schooled him at home, which in this case meant in that room, with a tablet and a workbook. The boy was allowed out for meals, for bathroom trips, for very little else. Diane described a child who spoke in a flat, practiced monotone, who ate quickly and efficiently, who never asked for anything, and who had taught himself, somewhere along the way, to take up as little space as possible. 7 years old, and already a ghost. Ray had sat very still through this part of Diane's account. He had thought, with the clarity of a man thinking about something that has been waiting in him for a long time, about a little girl who had learned to accept things without screaming, about a boy who had learned to disappear, about the way cruelty trains the people around it. And then he'd thought about Annie, about what she would have been, about what she would have refused to accept loudly and defiantly at age 7 and 8 and 9, because she had never been taught that the world wasn't safe. He made the call to Walt Briggs. He sat in the parking lot of a gas station on Route 9. Not the same one, but the same kind, with the same flat Indiana sky overhead and the same smell of diesel and cut grass. And he listened as the line connected and Diane's voice, tiny through the phone, began to speak. You might think the hardest part was over. You would be wrong. Walt Briggs moved fast. Ray had been right about that. Within 2 hours of Diane's call, there were 2 cruisers on Sycamore Trace and a child welfare officer named Carol Mead knocking on the door of the house with the white siding and the brown shutters. Kurt Spence was not home. Diane was. She let them in. Carol Mead would later describe in her case notes what she found in the locked room at the back of the house. The notes were precise and professional, as case notes are required to be. They did not include the part where she stood in the doorway for a long moment before she could bring herself to walk in. The notes did not include the way Tommy Spence looked up from a workbook when the door opened. Not with surprise, not with hope, but with the carefully assembled blankness of a child who had learned not to react to things until he knew whether they were good or bad. He'd had to learn that lesson so thoroughly that it had become his resting face. 7 years old, and he already had a resting face. Both children were removed from the home. Lacey went willingly. She held Carol Mead's hand and walked out to the car without looking at her mother. And then, at the last moment, she turned around. Diane was standing in the doorway, and whatever passed between them, whatever small, complicated, layered transaction a 5-year-old and her frightened mother conducted in a single glance, Ray, watching from the end of the street in his truck, could not read. But he saw Diane raise her hand. Not a wave. Something smaller. An acknowledgement. And then the car door closed, and both kids were gone. Kurt Spence came home at 9:14 that night. 2 deputies were waiting. He was not cooperative. The arrest took longer than it should have, and one of the deputies ended up with a bruised forearm, which told Ray, when Walt called to let him know it was done, more about Kurt Spence's character than anything else in the file. He was charged with child endangerment, with unlawful confinement of a minor, Tommy, with domestic battery, based on Diane's statement. Diane herself was charged separately with failure to report, a charge that would later be reduced in exchange for her cooperation, her testimony, and her attendance in a state-mandated parenting intervention program. None of this happened quickly. None of this happened cleanly. The legal system is not a clean machine. It grinds slowly, and it catches things between its gears, and sometimes the things it catches are people. But it moved, and Ray went home. He sat at his kitchen table, the same one where he'd looked up Kurt Spence's license plate 2 weeks earlier, and he ate a microwave dinner and watched the last of the daylight drain out of the Indiana sky. He wasn't sure what he felt. Not triumph. This wasn't a victory. It was a correction, and corrections don't feel like victories. They feel like the moment you finally stop a slow bleed. Not peace. The kids were an emergency foster placement, which meant strangers, which meant another upheaval in lives that had already been upheaved past what any child should absorb. He thought about Lacey on the curb, the quiet crying, the face paint over the bruise, the way she'd looked at Pete Dolan's enormous arm and decided, after a calculation he would never know the details of, to lean against it. He thought about Tommy, whom he'd never met, sitting in a room with a tablet and a workbook and the practiced face of a ghost. He thought about what Carol Mead had told him, briefly, in the parking lot after the children were placed, that the system would find a long-term placement, that it took time, that they'd look for relatives first. He pulled out his phone. He stared at it for a while. Then he texted Pete Dolan. "I'm thinking about something," he wrote. Pete's response came back in under a minute. "I know." Then after a pause, "You should." There are moments in a person's life where they make a decision that doesn't feel like a decision at the time, where they just find themselves one morning doing the next thing and the next thing without ever having sat down and formally concluded anything. Where the decision gets made somewhere below the level of conscious thought in the part of a person that still knows what they need even when the thinking part has gone quiet. Ray Hargrove went to the Department of Child Services office in Danville, Indiana, on a Tuesday morning in October. He wore his least worn jeans and a shirt that buttoned at the collar. He did not bring the bike. He sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room for 40 minutes. And when the caseworker, not Carol Meade, a different one, a younger woman named Patrice who had the efficient energy of someone carrying 17 active cases, called his name, he walked into her office and sat down. She asked him what he was there about. He said he wanted to inquire about emergency foster placement for 2 specific children. Patrice looked at his file. He'd filled out the preliminary inquiry form at the front desk, and then she looked at him with a level, practiced expression of someone who had learned not to let hope rise too fast. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "you have no prior relationship to these children. I know, you're single. You live alone. I know, you're 44 years old, and," she checked the form, "you've been licensed for fostering before?" "I started the process 4 years ago," he said. "I didn't finish it." He paused. "I wasn't ready." "What makes you think you're ready now?" Ray thought about it for long enough that Patrice seemed to think he might not answer. "Because I almost didn't stop," he finally said. "At that gas station. I almost didn't stop. I was tired, and it was someone else's problem, and I told myself some other adult would handle it. And I can live with a lot of things," he paused. "I've had to live with a lot of things. But I cannot live with almost not stopping." Patrice looked at him. She made a note. She did not promise him anything. She explained the process, the background check, the home study, the training hours, the court approval required for specific placement. She explained that the children had been separated for initial assessment and that there were many factors involved in determining placement. She explained that the boy, Tommy, had legal complications given his relation to the arrested man. She explained all the ways in which this was complicated. Ray nodded through every single one. When she was done, he said, "Tell me what I have to do." What followed was not a montage. It was not a series of warm, golden-lit scenes with swelling music. It was 4 months of paperwork, interviews, home inspections, a background check that went back further than Ray thought possible, mandatory training courses held on Saturday mornings in a church basement in Avon, a psychological evaluation that left him feeling scraped out for 3 days afterward, and a series of court hearings he attended in the same button-collar shirt, sitting in the back of the room, watching the legal machinery grind through the lives of 2 children he had met on a curb in a locked room. He did not see Lacey or Tommy during those 4 months. He was not permitted to. But Carol Meade, who had taken a personal interest in the case, the way certain professionals do when something gets past their professional distance and becomes something more, would sometimes, not as a matter of official protocol, but as a matter of human decency, tell him that Lacey was doing well, that she was drawing, that she had started speaking louder. And once, in passing, she mentioned that Tommy had asked the foster family, after about 6 weeks, if he could have a dog. "That's good, right?" Ray asked. "It means he's starting to believe he can want things," Carol said. "For a child like Tommy, that's very good." The hearing that determined placement was held on a Wednesday in February. Ray sat in the courtroom and heard the caseworker present the summary. He heard the guardian ad litem, a woman appointed to represent the children's interests, give her recommendation. He heard the details of Kurt Spence's situation, convicted on 2 of the 3 charges, sentenced to 4 years. Diane Mercer, charges reduced, probation, parenting classes, no contact with Tommy. The children needed a placement. There were no suitable relatives. Maternal grandmother had a prior CPS finding of her own. Paternal grandmother of Tommy was elderly and in assisted living. The guardian ad litem spoke about the need for sibling placement, keeping Lacey and Tommy together if possible, and about the psychological benefits of a stable, consistent home environment. Then the judge, a man named Judge Farrell, who had the kind of unhurried voice that made everything sound considered, asked if there were any petitioners for placement present in the courtroom. Ray stood up. He had not been told to stand. He hadn't planned to stand. He just did it the way he'd gotten off his bike at a gas station because something made him look again. Judge Farrell looked at him over his glasses. Mr. Hargrove. Yes, sir. You've completed the foster certification process. Yes, sir. You're petitioning for placement of both children. Together. Yes, sir. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Can you tell me, in your own words, why you believe you are the appropriate placement for these children? Ray thought about all the things he could say. About Annie. About Susan. About 6 years of riding on Saturdays and not sleeping on weekdays and carrying a grief so heavy he'd just eventually stopped noticing its weight. About the plastic chair in the DCS waiting room and the 4 months of Saturday morning training classes in the church basement and the home inspector who had looked at Annie's old bedroom, still as she'd left it, toys still on the shelf, and asked gently if Ray had thought about what that room might mean to a child. He'd painted it. Blue. The calm, plain blue of a morning sky. I can't give you a formula, Ray said. I'm a contractor. I know how to build things, and I know how to fix things, and I know that both of those skills are mostly about showing up and doing the next step. He paused. I don't have a speech. I just know that I was in a parking lot 4 months ago, and I looked at a little girl on a curb, and she had learned, at 5 years old, to accept something that no child should ever accept. And I drove past a house later, and there was a boy inside who had learned to disappear. He stopped. I can't fix what was done to them, but I can be someone who shows up. I've been doing the next step for 4 months, and I intend to keep doing it. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Farrell made a note. He didn't rule that day. It was never that fast, even in stories like this, especially in real ones. There were more hearings, more paperwork. A home visit where a court representative sat in Ray's living room and drank coffee and looked at the blue bedroom and the yard with the fence and the dog. P. Dolan had eventually, inevitably, given Ray one of his grandkids' rescue lab mixes, a goofy, ungainly thing named Rusty, and asked Ray careful questions about his daily schedule, his work hours, his support network. Ray's support network, as it turned out, was 14 bikers and a neighbor woman who sold eggs. The court representative wrote that down without any particular expression. The call came on a Thursday morning in March. Ray was on a job site, a kitchen renovation in Plainfield, when his phone rang. He was under a cabinet with a drill. He pulled himself out, checked the screen, and walked outside. It was Patrice from DCS. He stood in the driveway of the house in Plainfield, Indiana, in the thin March sunshine, with his drill still in his hand, and listened. When she was done, he said, "When?" 2 weeks, she said. "We'll do a gradual transition. Visit first, then an overnight, then the full placement. Standard protocol." "Right," Ray said. His voice was doing something strange. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Hargrove," Patrice said, and there was something in her voice that sounded different from the efficient case management tone he'd come to associate with her. Something warmer. "I've been in this job for 11 years. People go through this process for a lot of reasons, and some of those reasons hold, and some of them don't. I just want you to know that," she paused. "What you did, going to that woman's workplace, what you said to her, it was the thing that moved the needle. She'd been calculating for 8 months. She hadn't been able to make the call, and you gave her something to calculate with that she hadn't had before." Ray looked at the thin Indiana sky above the driveway. "What was that?" he asked. "The future," Patrice said. "You showed her what it would look like later. For Lacey, when she was old enough to understand the difference." Ray didn't say anything. 2 weeks, Patrice said again. "Get the dog ready." The first visit was a Saturday. Carol Mead brought them. She'd stayed on the case past her normal rotation, which Ray suspected was not entirely procedural. She pulled up in a gray agency sedan, and Ray was standing on the front porch, and Rusty was beside him, vibrating with approximately 11,000 volts of Labrador energy. The car doors opened. Tommy got out first. He was tall for 7, long-limbed, pale, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that did that same quick assessment Ray had come to recognize, the same inventory of threat and safety that Lacey had done on the curb. He stood beside the car and looked at the house and the yard and the man on the porch and the dog. Then he looked at the dog for about 4 seconds longer than everything else. Lacey came around from the other side. She was wearing a red jacket. Her hair was in 2 uneven pigtails that suggested she'd done them herself, or had strong opinions about how they should look. She looked at Ray. He stepped off the porch. He crouched down, the same distance he kept on the curb, the same posture, open hands, and he waited. Lacey looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Is it your dog?" "That's Rusty," Ray said. "He's been waiting to meet you." Rusty, as if understanding his cue, sat down with enormous dignity and then immediately sneezed on Ray's knee. Lacey laughed. It came out of her like something that surprised her, quick and bright and completely unguarded, the kind of laugh that a child only produces when they've forgotten, just for a second, to be careful. Ray felt it hit him somewhere in the center of his chest like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 6 years. He stood up. He looked at Tommy, still standing by the car, still doing his inventory. "Hey, Tommy," Ray said. "Rusty can shake hands if you want to see it." Tommy considered this for a very long time. Then he walked over. That was how it started. Not with a grand gesture, not with a speech, not with the kind of dramatic single moment that makes a good thumbnail. It started with a dog that sneezed at the wrong time. It started with a laugh that surprised a 5-year-old girl. It started with a 7-year-old boy walking across a yard because a dog could shake hands, and that was, apparently, worth checking out. The overnight was 3 weeks later. The full placement followed. There were hard nights, more than Ray had expected, or maybe exactly as many as he should have expected. Tommy woke up with nightmares that he refused to describe, sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, methodically eating cereal, because something about the routine of it seemed to help. Ray started leaving a box of cereal on the counter every night. He never mentioned it. Tommy never mentioned it. It was their arrangement. Lacey had a period about 6 weeks in where she tested everything, every boundary, every rule, every response, with a focused intensity of a scientist running experiments. Ray would later describe it to Pete Dolan as the scariest 2 weeks of his life, which, considering what Ray Hargrove had been through, was saying something considerable. "She's checking," Carol Mead told him when he called her somewhat desperately one evening. "She's checking to see what happens when she pushes, whether the safe thing stops being safe." "And what do I do?" Ray asked. "You stay," Carol said. "You don't go anywhere. You don't yell. You don't withdraw. You just stay." Ray stayed. The experiment stopped. There is a moment, he would remember it later, though it didn't announce itself as significant at the time, that happened on a Saturday in early June. Ray was in the backyard. He was building a raised garden bed. Not because he gardened exactly, but because Tommy had mentioned with studied nonchalance that his mother in Ohio used to grow tomatoes, and Ray had thought, okay, tomatoes it is. He was measuring lumber, pencil behind his ear, Rusty asleep in the sun beside a bucket. Lacey came outside in her rain boots, which she had taken to wearing regardless of weather, and stood beside him. "What are you building?" she asked. "Garden," he said. "For vegetables." "What kind?" "Tomatoes, to start. Maybe peppers. Whatever you guys want." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Can we grow strawberries?" "I don't know how to grow strawberries," Ray said, "but I can learn." She picked up a scrap piece of wood and turned it over in her hands. She had face paint on again. She'd had a friend's birthday party that morning, and there was a blue and green butterfly on her cheek, same design as the one in the parking lot. And for a moment, Ray had to breathe through the sight of it. But it was just face paint this time, just the color and the art of it. Nothing underneath. "Ray," she said. "Yeah." She didn't look up from the wood. "Are we staying here?" He put down his measuring tape. "Yeah," he said. "You're staying here." She turned the scrap of wood over once more. Then she set it down, picked up his pencil, the one for behind his ear, and wrote something on the end of a plank. He looked at it later, after she'd gone inside. She'd written, in careful, slightly uneven 5-year-old letters, "Lacey lives here." Ray stood in the backyard with the June sunlight on his face for a long moment. Rusty thumped his tail against the grass without opening his eyes. He did not cry, because he was a 44-year-old man from Mooresville, Indiana, who had weathered enormous things with his jaw tight and his hands busy. He cried a little. The formal adoption petition was filed 8 months after placement. It took another 7 months to finalize. There were hearings, reports, evaluations, the full grinding machinery of family law, which is thorough because it has to be, and slow because thoroughness is slow. Tommy turned 9 in a motel breakfast room during one of the court trips because the hearing had been scheduled on his birthday and they'd had to travel the night before, and Ray hadn't thought to check the date until they were already booked. He bought a grocery store cake from a gas station mini mart at 11 at night. Chocolate slightly squashed on one side, and put 9 birthday candles in it and sang happy birthday in the motel room with Lacey, completely off key, while Tommy watched with the expression of someone trying very hard to store this moment somewhere safe inside him. Tommy blew out the candles, all 9 in one breath. "What did you wish for?" Lacey demanded. "You're not supposed to say," Tommy told her. "I know, but tell me." Tommy thought about it. "I wish that Rusty doesn't have to stay at Pete's anymore when we travel." Ray made a note to buy a portable dog crate. The day the adoption was finalized was an ordinary Tuesday. There were no balloons in the courtroom. Judge Farrell, the same judge, the same unhurried voice, read the decree and signed the order, and that was legally that. Ray shook the judge's hand. Carol Meade was there, technically off the clock, in regular clothes, and she was crying in the professionally composed way of someone trying not to cry. Pete Dolan was in the hallway. There had been a brief, spirited debate about whether the whole Iron Road chapter should come, and cooler heads had prevailed at 11 men, leaving Pete as the sole representative, which was somehow still a significant physical presence in a courthouse hallway. On the way home, they stopped at a diner. Lacey ordered pancakes with chocolate chips and ate every one. Tommy ordered a burger and then halfway through said, quietly, without looking up, "Can I have a milkshake?" "Yeah," Ray said. "You can have a milkshake." He watched them. The girl with the uneven pigtails, the boy who was slowly, month by month, adding color back to his voice. The dog who was waiting in the car because Pete had driven separately specifically to ensure canine supervision. He thought about a parking lot on Route 9, about the diesel smell and the flat Indiana sky and a tire pump clicking and a little girl on a curb crying in a quiet way. He thought about almost not stopping. People would ask him later what had made him stop. Reporters asked him briefly because this story had a limited window of newsworthiness, and then the news moved on the way it does. Friends asked. Ruth Alderman from Sycamore Trace, who had become an unlikely but devoted presence in the kids' lives, asked him over coffee one afternoon. He always gave different answers depending on the day. Sometimes he said he didn't know. Sometimes he said it was the quiet crying. Sometimes he said it was Annie. But the truest answer was the one he gave to Tommy once, when Tommy was 10 and had, in the direct way he developed of asking the things that had been inside him for a while, said, "Did you know, when you saw her, that you were going to do something about it?" Ray thought about it for a long time. "No," he said. "I didn't know anything. I just knew I couldn't drive away." Tommy was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you didn't, he said. It was said simply, factually, in the flat Tommy voice that meant something deeper than it sounded. The Tommy voice that Ray had learned to hear correctly. Me too, buddy, Ray said. Me too. Outside in the yard, Lacey was running. Not from anything, not toward anything, just running the way kids run when they have room and energy and the specific freedom of a summer afternoon. Rusty was running with her, his big goofy legs churning through the grass, his tail a metronome of pure, uncomplicated joy. She had face paint on, blue and green, a butterfly smeared already from the running, streaking down her cheek. The happy kind. Ray watched from the porch. He thought, this is what it looks like. Not fixed. Nothing is ever fully fixed. Not erased. The past is in them. In Tommy's 2 a.m. cereal rituals and Lacey's careful watching of doors. Not simple, but alive. Present. Moving forward into a future that was theirs. He pulled out his phone and took a picture. Not for anyone else. Just for himself. Just so he'd have it. The image of a girl running in a yard with a smeared butterfly on her cheek, laughing at a dog, on a regular Tuesday afternoon in Indiana. Just so he'd always have proof that some things, if you stop when you almost don't, can still come out like this. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever been the person who almost didn't stop, and then did, you already know what Ray knows. Sometimes the whole world turns on a single moment of choosing not to look away. We'll see you next time.